This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 944 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. On last week's Sleeper episode, I called out Aaron Rodgers and Daniel Jones as streamers, and that didn't work out. Andrei Iosivas didn't do much in a great matchup either. I got the Saints wide receivers wrong, and Ray Davis only saw 3 touches. Russell Wilson and Jaylen Warren worked out though. Ricky Pearsall was a strong play, and Rashad Bateman was a good player to call out. Now, the last month of this show hasn't been fantastic, but there were at least some good picks in there last week. We're now on to week 11. Now, before I get to the sleepers this week, I just want to remind you to check out Underdog. Over on Underdog, you can play Pick'em and Champions mode, and of course, you can do snake drafts each week too. Just looking at the lobby, there are literally over 20 drafts that you can join right now for this week's slate. To check it all out, head to UnderdogFantasy.com and sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit offer, and it'll also get you a link to my rest of season rankings. That's if you sign up with promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and start playing. Now let's get to these sleepers. We'll kick things off as usual with players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you might want to start this week. I've got 4 quarterback streamers in this tier. I think all of them are actually pretty strong. Bo Nix is one of them. He's averaged over 20 points per game over his last 6, and he's hit 36 or more rushing yards in 3 of his last 5. He gets Atlanta this week. The Falcons are a top 10 matchup for quarterbacks when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. The Broncos also have the best matchup in the league this week when looking at how much pressure defenses generate against them versus how much pressure the Falcons generate. It's not surprising to see Denver with a strong 23-point total. They're in a good spot. I talked about Russell Wilson on the 15 Transaction Show, so naturally, he's going to get a shout out here as well. The Steelers get the Ravens. Baltimore's been the 3rd best matchup for quarterbacks this season by adjusted points allowed, and quarterbacks against Baltimore have thrown for 77 more yards in their season-long averages. That's by far the highest adjusted passing yards allowed mark in the league. The Steelers have a totally fine 22.5 point team total too. Baltimore's a team that teams are throwing on. I'd expect the same for Pittsburgh this weekend. I think you could even look at Drake May this week. He's got a Rams team that's just a little bit above average as a matchup when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And there's definitely some fear that the Rams are going to be able to get to him. They actually rank 2nd this year in pressure rate generated. The Patriots, they haven't been great at limiting that pressure. That could allow May, though, to run a little bit more than usual. And we know that he can escape the pocket and run. He's averaging 44 rushing yards per game in games that he's started and finished this year. That baseline has allowed him to score between 12 and 21 points in each of his 4 starts. His only real bad game was last week, but last week he faced Chicago. That's a team that ranks as the toughest opponent for quarterbacks this year. I think Wilson and Nix are better plays, but May works as a deeper one. And then people probably won't trust this recommendation as much, but Aaron Rodgers, you guys, he's still out there in 53% of Yahoo leagues, and he gets the Colts. I know that he didn't come through in what looked like a decent matchup last week against Arizona, but Indianapolis is an even better one on paper. They rank as the 7th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Rodgers had been averaging 17 points per game across the last month before his Week 10 poop fest against Arizona. So it's not like he's incapable of making some noise in fantasy. With a near 24-point implied team total, I think we might need to have a short memory and look at Rodgers as an okay streamer this week. Now moving on to running back, let's start with another 15 transactions player, that's Audric Estime. Now I'm not sure how much receiving work Estime is going to get after a 21% route share in Week 10. But Estime had a Broncos season-high 82% running back rush share against the Chiefs. And while he didn't produce a ton, we have to recognize that Kansas City is by far the toughest matchup in football for running backs. Atlanta's actually pretty good against running backs too, at least by adjusted fantasy points allowed. But they're a better matchup. And like I said with Bo Nix, there are reasons to be optimistic about the Broncos this week. The bottom line is that if Estime continues seeing this kind of workload, more fantasy points are going to be scored. Tyjae Spears is kind of interesting this week. He finally returned to the Titans in Week 10. He had a few weeks off. He saw 44% of the team's running back rushes and a pretty solid 13% target share. He ran a route on 42% of their dropbacks. That's not a bad number, especially for sort of the 1B in his offense. We've seen the Titans at times this year deploy Tyjae Spears as their negative game script back. That could hit this week. They get the Vikings, and Minnesota is about a 6-point favorite. The Vikings have also allowed the 6th highest adjusted target share this season to running backs. That plays right into what Spears has done best so far in the NFL. Now, you should definitely prefer Tony Pollard, but Tyjae Spears isn't seeing a horrible workload himself. The last time we saw the Browns, Jerome Ford was coming off an injury. He ended up seeing a 6.5% target share and about 10% of the team's running back rushes. But his route participation wasn't that bad in that game. He ran a route on 54% of Cleveland's dropbacks. Now, I'm not sure that we can assume some massive negative game script this week against the Saints, but New Orleans have been gashed on the ground this year. They've allowed the 5th most adjusted points to the position, and they rank well below average in adjusted rushing yards allowed to running backs. I think clearer negative game scripts may benefit Ford more than a matchup like this, but we're not going to bat 1,000 when it comes to predicting how games are going to unfold. If you're desperate, the matchup is at least there, and his usage is not a total 0. The last running back in this tier is Gus Edwards. He's sort of similar to Audric Estime, and then he's not going to see that much work through the air, more than likely. Except with Estime, we at least have some unknown upside. With Edwards, we know it won't be the case. We have years of data pointing to Gus Edwards not being a receiving threat. Regardless, the Chargers get the Bengals this week. Cincinnati, they've been more vulnerable through the air than on the ground this season. And it is projected to be a decently high-scoring game. The Chargers have a decent implied team total. So if you need a body, Edwards could be that body. He should see 10 or so touches. Moving to wide receiver, Jerry Jeudy is still under that 50% mark. So let's talk about him. In Jameis Winston's 2 starts, so over Jerry Jeudy's last 2 games, he's seen target shares of 20% and 24%. That's led to PPR totals of 13 and 14. He's run a route on every single Cleveland Browns dropback during that time. So we're getting a player who's seeing above average target shares, getting above average usage, and he's in an above average to average matchup against a Saints team that ranks 15th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. If that doesn't define this sleeper show, I don't know what does. Now, I didn't think that we would see Ricky Pearsall be eligible for this show anymore, but at the time of this recording, he's still not above that 50% mark. So you should use him. Pearsall has now seen target shares of 16%, 16%, and 18% in his 3 games this year. And we can project him to see like a 70 to 80% route share this week for San Francisco. The 49ers get the Seahawks. Seattle's defense has been kind of rough across the board this year. They're well below average in both adjusted passing yards and running back rushing yards allowed. And they rank as almost a top 10 matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Pearsall's fine on a team with a high implied team total. Quentin Johnston's target shares haven't been like fantastic. He actually hasn't seen a target share of 20% since week 2. But this past week, he saw a route participation of 96%. He's getting run. And like I said with Gus Edwards, this doesn't profile as a super low scoring game, given you've got Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow going up against one another. And Cincinnati is a good matchup. They're the 8th best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed, and teams are throwing to wide receivers at an above average rate when they face the Bengals. So Johnston's an okay play. Demario Douglas is a high floor option as long as Drake May is under center. We've now had 3 games of May and Douglas, where May finished the game and Douglas wasn't sick, aka where Douglas played his typical role. In those games, Douglas is averaging almost a 25% target share per game rate, and he hasn't fallen below the 20% mark. The matchup this week against the Rams out of the slot, it's not necessarily ideal because most teams target the outside against them. But he's being used enough to get a call out on today's show. And then finally at wide receiver, I'm going to go back to Noah Brown. Brown saw a season best 97% route share in week 10 against the Steelers. He's now seen target shares of 18%, 32%, and 22% over his last 3 games. The Eagles have been really good defensively this season for fantasy purposes, and that could be a problem for Washington in week 11, there's no doubt. But Brown is almost exclusively a perimeter player, and the Eagles rank 27th in adjusted slot target share allowed, meaning teams are typically thrown to the boundary against them. That could benefit Noah Brown. Now moving on to tight end, he hasn't been producing that well, but Hunter Henry is still seeing good peripherals. He's hit a 20% target share in 3 of his last 4. He's been at 17% in all 4 of those games. Now he gets a Rams team that ranks favorable for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. So he's not a bad option. And then I'm going to go back to Jonnu Smith too. The Dolphins get a Raiders team this week that ranks 10th in adjusted target share allowed to tight ends and 5th in adjusted points allowed. Like it or not, the Dolphins are using Jonnu Smith. He's averaging a 22% target share per game rate over his last 5. This is a really good spot for him. This next tier of players consists of guys rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. As I say each week, this is where we start to dig deep. Now, I don't have a quarterback in this tier, but I do have one running back. I can't say that I love him. That's why he's rostered in so few leagues, but we can talk about him. It's Jalen Wright. He ended up seeing 29% of Miami's running back rushes in week 10. That's basically a high for him with Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert healthy. The Dolphins get the Raiders, like I just talked about. Vegas is number 1, not very good, so a nice positive game script is possible, but they're number 2, one of the worst teams in adjusted points allowed to running backs and adjusted rushing yards allowed to running backs. If the game script goes favorably for Miami, Wright could get some work. Now moving on to wide receiver, a much more reasonable option is Elijah Moore. Over Cleveland's last 2 games with Jameis Winston, Moore has run about 71% of his routes out of the slot. New Orleans, their opponent, ranks 7th in adjusted slot target share allowed this year. They've also given up a below average yards per route run rate to that area of the field. Moore has seen target shares over his last 2 of 29% and 19%. There's reason to believe that he can produce this week. Kayshon Boutte's another one. I already talked about Demario Douglas against the Rams. I think the better matchup, the individual matchup, is with Kayshon Boutte. He's going to see those outside targets that I was talking about earlier. Boutte ran a route on 100% of the team's dropbacks last week. That led to a 26% target share. If he gets close to that in a much more favorable matchup this week, he should be good. And then I also have Nick Westbrook-Ikhine here. Westbrook-Ikhine has seen route shares of 95%, 97%, and 100% since DeAndre Hopkins left the Titans. That's led to a target share per game rate of 15%. Now, is that a good target share for that much running? Not really. But the Titans get a Minnesota team this week that's allowed the 5th most adjusted points to wide receivers this year. They've given up a top 5 number in adjusted passing yards allowed. So maybe a negative game script hits and the Titans are forced to throw a lot. Would we be surprised if that happened? Probably not. That would benefit Westbrook-Ikhine because we know that he's unlikely going to take over this game. And then 2 tight ends for you in this tier. Will Dissly, someone that I called out earlier this week because he's essentially just taken over that tight end 1 role for the Chargers. LA has a top 10 matchup against Cincinnati in a game where there's a chance that they're forced to throw the ball more than usual. So Dissly's a good one. And then how about Davis Allen? I almost talked about Allen on the 10 Trends episode, but after seeing a 45% route participation in week 9, it jumped up to 88% this past week. He had a 14% target share as a result. That was a season high. He's playing as the Rams' top pass-catching tight end. Now, New England is not some special opponent, but they're not a bad one either. It's just that Allen getting this kind of run makes him a deep sleeper. Now on defense, hopefully you got Green Bay and Miami off the waiver wire before they jumped over that 50% mark. And then as much as I'm talking up the Patriots this week because I like Drake May, I don't mind Demario Douglas, I like Kayshon Boutte, within context, I do think the Rams defense has a chance to generate a lot of pressure this weekend. So I like them as a streaming defense. Now we're on to Underdog to make a couple of picks. Again, I'm focused only on using players from this show, so I'm limiting myself a bit, but here goes. We'll start with Russell Wilson going higher than 223.5 passing yards. Again, Baltimore typically sees their opponents throw for 77 more yards than their season-long averages. Russell Wilson has been above this mark in 2 of his 3 games. So I do like this pick. Then I'm also going to say higher than 33.5 receiving yards for Kayshon Boutte. And then one more, Jonnu Smith, higher than 32.5 receiving yards. He's been over that mark in 4 of his last 5. He's been below 45 yards just once during that time. If you want to join me with those selections, remember to just head to underdogfantasy.com and use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Late Round QB. I'm also on Blue Sky now, also at Late Round QB. And check out the YouTube channel, the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with a mailbag episode and then another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.